You are now tuned in to the Mind Wanderers podcast, the podcast where we wander and explore the world around us. I'm your host, Timi Chatellou, and this is episode 4. Hello and welcome to the Mind Wanderers podcast, where I take random themes, topics, questions and ideas that our minds may wander to. I just want to start off this podcast with a big shout out to tea, because I actually love tea. I have like 6 to 7 cups of tea every single day at work, and in this stupid weather where it just decides to forget what heat is, tea is actually the real MVP right now. So I just want to shout out to tea. I know some of you are thinking, oh, what about coffee? But at the end of the day, coffee is for some of you guys that are wired a bit different. So nah. Before I forget, thank you to anyone who's listened to any of the previous episodes of the Mind Wanderers podcast. I really appreciate it. The first 3 episodes, the first one being on mind wandering, the second one being on gamification, and the third one is the legendary episode on why the fuck do we cross our legs. If you did like those bad boys, then please share that with anyone that you think may like the podcast or you think has a similar thinking to you, so you guys can share some information and get the message out about mind wandering. So thank you to anyone who eventually does do that. So back to tea now. So I'm making tea last week and I'm adding some sugar in, as you normally do when you're making tea. And even though I shouldn't really be adding sugar, because diabetes does run through my family, and the way I add sugar to stuff is just frankly unacceptable, and I should really stop doing it. But I have actually started moving into the sweeteners, but they just have a kind of powdery taste about them. It's not like the same, like, I don't know, unhealthy feel of the sugar cubes, if you guys understand me. But anyway, so I'm adding sugar in, and if you do you guys remember something called the sugar tax that was introduced last year in 2018, which was just basically upping the price of drinks or any foods or sports drinks that actually have a lot of sugar in it? And this was basically to prevent people consuming a ridiculous amount of sugar, or basically driving up the prices of the drinks to potentially put people away from actually drinking sugary drinks. But I was just thinking about it. So there's a sugar tax, there's a congestion charge, there's a council tax, there's a everything tax. What would happen if one day all of us just decided, fuck it, I ain't paying it, I'm not paying any tax, I'm not doing it? Like, if we all just decided, even though that is never going to happen, what is going to be the result of that? You just take a second to think, what would be the result if once, like, any one time people just decide, no, fuck it, I'm not paying it? What would happen? That's what I thought. But nah, it actually doesn't work like that, because actually I think the government actually withhold a lot of your money. So technically the government already have your money. But just to say, if we were to actually do that one day, we were to actually just say we're not going to pay tax, what would actually happen? Because a lot of the time we hear in the elections, oh, we're going to bring up tax, oh, we're going to drive down tax, oh, we're going to tax the rich, oh, we're not going to tax the poor, and everyone just gets sick and tired of hearing about tax. And so I just thought one day, what would actually happen if we didn't pay tax? Would everything just cease to work? And when I started looking into it, it would basically just end in anarchy. So I don't think that's the best way about going about things. But it was just something I was thinking about, like, what would actually happen if we just decided, fuck it, we're not paying tax anymore? So anyway, as tax led me to the elections, I am now going to spend a tiny section talking about the elections, which frankly I don't really care about, but you know what, we're here now anyway. Let's just start. Boris Johnson, don't really give 2 shits about him. He's kind of a liar, but at the end of the day, I agree with him on one point. Brexit needs to get done. And I know I'm not some right-wing, blah, 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 sympathizer or something like that. I'm just someone who's very principled. And I just feel like sometimes, even if a decision isn't what you want it to be, at the end of the day, when a group of people take a vote, you have to go with a group of people, however dumb that may seem. And then you can continue to persuade them after you've taken the action, but at the end of the day. So that's the only reason why I'm kind of on Boris Johnson's side. Next up, we've got Corbyn. Corbyn, I actually really do like. He has some policies that I like, but at the end of the day, his kind of stance on the anti-Semitism thing is kind of weird. And also, I understand that he's someone, from what I've seen of him, he's someone that doesn't want to go against his word. So if he said something in the past and now the situation is different and people are expecting him to maybe say sorry or maybe say, oh, I'm going to vote a particular side, he doesn't do that, because at the end of the day, he said what he's had to say. So in his head, he's already saying, you know what, I've said what I had to say. Next up, we've got, what's her name? The one I don't like. She's got such a whiny face. Oh, Jo Swinson. I don't like her. I don't like her. That's just me. I just don't like her. Like, she just seems like one of those people that consistently complains, and just the stance the Liberal Democrats have taken just pisses me off. I don't understand how you can say you're a Liberal and a Democrat and a vote has been taken, but your stance is to say, nah, fuck it, we're going to stay on this side. That's not being a Democrat at all. Like, it's just a weird stance, and anytime she talks, it's just as if she's complaining, and I'm just not for it. So, nah, she's a no for me. And then when we move on to the rest of the parties, we're not really talking much. So at the end of the day, that's just where I stand with the election. And all of this is just to say, we're coming up to an election now, and I'm really, really, really in a weird place as to where I want to vote. Because my heart is telling me, you know what, I really want to stay in the EU. So at the end of the day, I want to remain. And so that's why some people will say, oh, so why are you complaining about the Liberal Democrats? Well, I said, that's my heart. And we all know your heart leads you to some very dumb places sometimes. And trust me, I know, because I've been outside at some dumb hours over some girls, and it's not funny. But then also my mind, or like the logical side of me, is telling me, you know what, at the end of the day, we've had a referendum, we take the decision, and all this back and forth with the EU of tugging away at, oh, are we gonna do it? Are you in? Are you out? Are you out? Are you in? I'm gonna find that clip because I really like that clip. I'm gonna play it and put it in here somewhere.
Are you in? Are you out? Are you out? Are you in? What do you want?
But yeah, all of that back and forth isn't really doing anyone any good. And so I feel like, in order for me, sometimes I feel like a clean break is sometimes the safest thing to do. And some people will be like, well, that's easy for you to say, or there's a lot of people that are going to suffer. Just for me personally, I feel like the world is not going to collapse at all if this was to happen. Like, we do have things in place, and that's why you have contingency plans if things go wrong. I could go into, some people could argue with me, well, that's Timi, you're stupid, you're not looking into the detail, a lot of people are going to suffer. But anyway, I don't even care about the election anymore, because on a real level, I've actually watched so much of House of Commons, government speaking. When Theresa May was in office, I was watching all those House of Commons debates. I watched everyone insult her. Just one thing I would also like to say, I really, 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 really respect Theresa May, because no one understands how it feels to be insulted by eloquent, smart people. Because hear me out, like, if dumb people are insulting you, what they do is that they'll pick something so random that doesn't even make sense. So it's very easy to brush it off. Plus, they're not going to phrase it in any good way for you to then say, oh yeah, like, no, that actually hurt. Instead, she had the most eloquent people in the nation in front of the world, basically berating her, basically insulting her. To some degree, some people calling her a liar, some people questioning her character, and she took all of that. Yes, she did cry a tiny bit. I'm not saying she didn't cry, but she took all of that and cried in the end. And I'm just going to say, she is a strong person. That is just my opinion. Anyway, now I'm going to actually go on to what I want to talk about today. So with all of this election talk around, with all of politics basically being in the air right now, one thing I always question is, where do I actually stand in politics? Like, do I actually have a side that I stand on? do I believe that I should have a side that I stand on? Because one thing I feel like with sides is that whenever you're on the side, you become part of a team. And when you're part of a team, most of the time people are ride or die, or like when it comes to politics, they're ride or die. So it's left side or left wing or die. Right wing or die. There's nothing. Some liberal Democrats, like, they're okay, but then they're kind of wish-washy. So I really wanted to discover for myself, and maybe help some of you guys to discover as well, what side or where do you actually stand in like the political spectrum, if you want to call it that. And I'm going to mix it in with an idea called gender fluidity. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but we shall do it. Little interlude to proceed. Okay, so I'm not here to actually talk about the elections, to be honest. If anything, I wanted to actually explore what actually drives the elections, what are the ideas and the principles behind what makes someone choose a political side, be it left or right, and why they get so passionate in defending that side. And one thing that I think of when I think of a passionate defender of their side, I remember, without giving away too much information, because I don't want to put her name out there, so I have to remember not to say her name, but my ex-girlfriend while I was in uni, a very lovely girl. She used to be very chill with most topics. Nothing really used to bother her, and that is probably why we got on so well. However, the one topic that she would never, ever, ever just let go was politics, and that was because politics to her was such it was such a right or wrong issue, or such a moral issue to her, that she couldn't see a way in which she couldn't argue for her side, for which she thought was the good side. And I always go back to one argument that I had with her, which basically shows how passionate people can get when they decide to pick a side in politics. And if you think of, she was a Labour supporter, and the reason why she was a Labour supporter was because her dad instilled that Labour support in her. So she effectively inherited that Labour support, or left-wing support, should I say. And so that wasn't her going off to do, she might have done research afterwards, however bias was already formed, so you're just basically going to read something that's going to confirm what you already believe to be true. So we had a big argument one time about George Bush, in which she called George Bush the devil and Margaret Thatcher the devil. And I know a lot of people on the left hold this view. However, I used to challenge her and say, how can you put moral values towards someone if you don't know the full facts of the situation? In the sense of, she used to see George Bush as the devil because of Iraq. And I used to tell her, well, at the time, we have to see everything with different, in retrospect, it's always easy to say that someone made the wrong decision. So we just basically used to go back and forth, but she used to get so passionate that they were the devil because they were basically seen to be on the other team, because George Bush and people like Margaret Thatcher were seen to be on the other side of the political spectrum, so she could never be in agreement with anything they've ever done. Whereas I'm someone who I try to look at stuff as objectively as possible, and with something like George Bush and the Iraq situation, not to go into it too much, I just somewhat think sometimes you have to see the situation and the hysteria at the time to maybe factor that in when someone's making a judgment. Following 9/11, I'm pretty sure there was loads of different feelings and emotions about. Now we know it was the wrong decision. Sorry, before we were rudely interrupted by the fire alarm system. That's just how I see the political sides. If you're either on the left or the right, you get very passionate. However, in my case, I neither feel as though I fully agree with the left or fully agree with the right. So I decided to take it upon myself to actually I went on the internet and I had a quick check as to whether there was any actual test that I could take to find out if where I stand in the political spectrum. So I did a bit of research and eventually I landed on one called the political compass. And apparently it's a very famous test that a lot of people have used over the years, and they use it in classrooms and politics lessons across the world, and they've been featured in newspaper articles and whatnot. But if you basically go onto the internet and type in political compass, you should be able to find it. It will be like the first result. So I took this test, and this test was what I wanted to tell me as to where I stand in the political spectrum. What is this? What's the answer to this grand question as to Timi's political stance? And I went through, it's like a combination of 6 different sections and loads of different questions, but I basically took a couple of questions which I found really interesting, and I'm going to post them on Instagram very soon. And one of the questions was, actually, before I start with the questions, let me explain what the test actually does. So in order to have a political stance, you need 2 things. You need a social freedom view and you need an economics view. And the social freedom view is put on a range, and the range is between a libertarian and an authoritarian. Authoritarian is the stance effectively that you have a blind submission to the government or a central leader, and that individual does not have any constitutional responsibility to the electorate if they're even elected. So think Hitler, think Stalin, and I recently found out that you can also count Mugabe, Robert Mugabe, who recently passed away, as an authoritarian leader. So that's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is a libertarian, and a libertarian upholds the liberty of individuals and also champions political choice and tries to maximize autonomy. So that is one scale, and that's the social freedom scale. The second scale you have is the economic scale, and this is where left and right wing come more into play. It started in the 18th century during the French Revolution, in which people who wanted the monarchy to stay and didn't want a new republic, they sat on the left, and people who wanted to get rid of the monarchy and wanted to basically implement a republic sat on the right hand side. And I just thought, oh, okay, so it's the French people who started all of this. Cool. So you're the reason why there's this much division. Anyway, left wing refers to people who believe that the economy should work to minimize social injustice, or minimize social inequality, should I say, and effectively the economy is working for the people, whereas the right wing side of economics is more free market, autonomy, there's less regulation, and you can make more money within that economy, and there's less regard to, there's poor people. It's more about money. So those are the 2 different sections. So you have a social freedom view and you also have economics view, and when you put those 2 views together, you then get a political stance. So what the test does is it takes a range of questions and then it plots you on a path that basically mixes in your social freedom view and also your view on economics. So this test has a range of questions which are engineered to put you in a situation in which you're thinking heavily as to what your principles are, and these principles will then guide your answers. So I thought it would be a really good activity to somewhat look at some of these questions, and then if that may pique your interest, to then go on and do the test yourself. So one of the questions was, our race has many superior qualities compared with other races. And for this question, I basically answered strongly disagree, because you have 4 different answers. You have strongly disagree, agree, and strongly agree. So for this question, I put strongly disagree, and that's because I know you can be proud of your race, but when it comes down to the scientific factors of what a race is. There's no race is better than the other. You may have anomalies of a person from a particular race that's very good at something. However, I don't think any race is superior in any shape or form. That just doesn't make sense in my head. Another question I found really interesting was people are ultimately divided more by class than by nationality. And I felt for this question, I answered agree, not strongly agree, just agree, because class plays so much in terms of everything we do, and in terms of how you see people, how you treat people, and in terms of how we're divided. No one will care if you're from whatever country if you're in the same shitty position in life as they are. Effectively, we're all together in this. So if we're all living in a crowded house and there's no space, and we're not in the upper echelons of society, I believe all those individuals will disregard nationality or races or whatnot, and effectively see it as we are all in this together, or all in this, I guess, tough position together. So I think, if anything, class definitely divides people more than nationality. A last question that I found really interesting is, in a civilized society, one must always have people above to be obeyed and people below to be commanded. I chose agree for that question on the basis that in this world we live in, we need some form of structure. If you have no form of structure, and when I say structure, I mean sometimes someone may be in a position higher than you, in which they'll need to give you some commands. I'm not referring to slavery, in which a slave needs to obey a master. I more mean in the sense of, you may have a teacher who needs to be obeyed. You may have a police officer who needs to be obeyed. I know a lot of you guys are just like, police officer, what are you talking about? No, we don't like the police. But yes, we all need the police at one point. So yes, people need to be obeyed. However, I'm conflicted with this, because I do know where this can lead to when people are being obeyed, and when the person who can give out commands doesn't really have any restrictions in terms of their commands. So that one's a bit iffy for me, but it's questions like this that the political compass test throws up, and it gets your mind thinking as to, what do I really agree with? What do I really disagree with? And how strongly do I have that opinion? Is it I just agree a bit, or is it I strongly agree with this principle? However, so I did the political compass test, and at the end, based on your different answers, it then puts you on a grid. And I would advocate for anyone listening to this prior to the election on the 12th of December to very much take this political test, and I think you'll be quite interested to see where you land and how it might inform your decision as to how you want to vote. I do know that this particular election has been hijacked by Brexit, so we're not technically voting on our political stances, but we're more so voting on whether we want to remain or leave the EU. But I would advocate that a lot of people do check out this political compass test, because a lot of us don't actually know where we stand when it comes to politics. And I'm not saying that you have to become like an expert or a professor in politics, but it will make you a more well-rounded person if you have some view on particular issues or world issues that affect everyone together. So again, check it out, Political Compass. It's on the internet. I'll actually post up, they have an Instagram page, so I'll post up some of their stuff on Instagram as well. But it's a really cool test, and they've got some other interesting questions, such as, you cannot be moral without being religious. And for this one, I put strongly disagree, but that is a conversation for another day. Moving on to the crux of my episode today, or the podcast episode today. And remember, I spoke about gender fluidity. So following taking the political compass test, I ended up being in the bottom left-hand quadrant, which is a social libertarian, which is someone who effectively believes that people should be in charge of their lives. And in an economic sense, I'm more leaning towards effectively national nationalizing our public services such as trains and such as the NHS. And I found that really weird because for a long time, after not taking this test and having taken no formal test, thought for a long time that I very much was on the right wing side of right wing side of a lot of issues. And when I got the result back from the political compass test, it still doesn't ring true with me. So after taking the whole test, it feels like it was just an abject task. I didn't really need to do it if I'm just going to end up saying I don't believe it. However, I just wanted to then explore this concept of not being left wing or right wing, and that then led me to gender fluidity. Because if you know about gender fluidity, for those people that don't know, that's like the non-binary. I don't know if you guys saw it. I believe his name is Sam Smith. He came out earlier on this year and said that he's non-binary, meaning that he doesn't see himself as a male or a female, or sometimes he sees himself as one, or sometimes he sees himself as the other. And I thought, as you may have noticed by now, that why don't I just mix in this idea of gender fluidity with politics? Because if you think about your gender, a lot of it is decided, your gender is decided for you, and what you should like off the back of that is decided for you based off your gender. And I feel this is also true when it comes to people and their politics, because a lot of us are told by our parents how they're voting, and then told to vote in line with our parents, and automatically we then start to presume that the way we are voting is the right way to vote, and also we are in agreement with that line of voting. Whereas in actual fact, a lot of us haven't taken the time to actually find out where we actually stand on a lot of different issues when it comes to politics. And I feel this would be a very good opportunity, while everyone is being wrapped up in Brexit, because you're not really going to change a lot of people's minds on Brexit anymore, for people to find out where exactly they stand on particular issues. And when you look at where you stand, and for myself, when I look at where I stand, I believe taking the particular issue will determine whether I see myself as maybe left wing, or maybe if I see myself as right wing. For myself, I grew up a Labour supporter because my parents always voted Labour, so it seemed the right thing to do to vote Labour. However, there may be some things with Labour nowadays that I don't somewhat agree with. I do see myself maybe being a bit more conservative on some type of economic issues, and so I feel it undersells the term left wing and right wing when you basically put a blanket over it and just cast yourself as a left-wing person or a right-wing person. I feel I want to call myself politically fluid now, because I do know now we can just introduce terms, and if it's catchy enough, everyone will run along with it. I don't know if you guys saw Hermione Granger. I don't know what her name is in real life, but the girl that played Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter movies, I believe it was, she is not married now, and I believe she's maybe coming up to 30, and she created the term self-partnered, and everyone just thought that was completely ingenious, and so she got all the plaudits for that. So hopefully with this new term, politically fluid, hopefully it catches on, and we're going to see a rise in politically fluid people. But jokes aside, I really do hope people can check out the political compass test on the internet, and then make a judgment as to where you stand as a person in the world, because politics, you cannot take yourself away from politics. So even if you have, just do the test one time, it takes less than 5 minutes. I did it in less than 5 minutes, or probably even 3. And again, like some of the questions you heard before, they're really interesting questions that really probe your brain and really challenge you as an individual to find out where you actually stay on particular issues that you may encounter in your day-to-day. So thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode of the Mind Wanderers podcast. For any of you politically fluid people out there, make sure you share this episode with friends and family. Remember, you can find the podcast on Instagram at mindwanderers_podcast, and on Twitter at mindwanderers. And that is it from me. This is the Mind Wanderers podcast. Peace.